some point, Vince, I'd like to hear about how you fell in love with Vienna as opposed to any other of the many cities you could have chosen.
You know what did it? It was, this is the biggest cliche in the world. It was Der Rosenkavalier when I was about 14.
It isn't the biggest. It could have been Sound of Music, but well, that would have been Salzburg, wouldn't it? So Rosenkavalier is okay.
In '66, when I was not quite so young anymore, I saw at the then New Met Die Frau ohne Schatten, and that absolutely did it. That was it. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right. Well, it looks like people are starting to arrive, so let me just give a brief introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Noah Mintz. I'm the event coordinator at the bookstore, and Community Bookstore is celebrating over 50 years in business, so we credit the continued support of readers and writers for this milestone. Thank you for spending the evening with us. I'm thrilled today to be collaborating once again with our friends at New York Review Books to welcome Vincent Kling, Daniel Kehlmann, and Tess Lewis for a discussion of Heimito von Doderer's The Strudlhof Steps, in celebration of the book's publication by NYRB Classics, in Vince's translation and with an afterword by Daniel. Now to some housekeeping before I introduce our guests. We have enabled Zoom's auto-transcribe setting, so if your version of Zoom is up to date, hit the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen to enable closed captions. If you have any questions for tonight's guests, please click on the Q&A button, also at the bottom of your screen, to submit them, and we will be asking those at the end of the program, so please don't be shy. There's a chat box through which I will be posting a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already. And one caveat for tonight is that we're all at the mercy of our home internet connections, so please bear with any technical issues that might arise. We'll try to resolve them quickly. We have a whole great lineup of events for you planned already this year, so head over to our website, communitybookstore.net, and sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date. One that I want to point out in particular is on Wednesday, February 2nd, we have another NYRB event, translator Esther Allen discussing Antonio Di Benedetto's The Silenzieri in conversation with Andres Barba. And on Saturday, February 19th, we're joining the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith in Massachusetts and Third Place Books in Seattle to bring you Nobel laureate in literature Olga Tokarczuk, presenting her masterpiece, The Books of Jacob, with her Booker Prize winning translator, Jennifer Croft. Both of those programs are up on our website now and taking registrations. Now about tonight's guests, and we'll get started with apologies in advance for my German pronunciation. Vincent Kling is a translator and scholar of German literature who teaches at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He has translated fiction, poetry, and criticism by Heimito von Doderer, Heimrad Backer, Andreas Pittler, Goethe Jonke, Gerhard Fritsch, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, and Aglaya Veterani. He was awarded the Schlegeltick Prize in 2013 for his translation of Veterani's Why the Child is Cooking in the Polenta. Daniel Kehlmann is a novelist, playwright, and screenwriter. His most recent novel, Till, was shortlisted for the 2020 International Booker Prize. He lives in New York. And Tess Lewis, who will be moderating tonight's discussion, has translated works from the French and German, including works by Peter Handke, Anselm Kiefer, Philippe Jacotet, and Christine Angot, and for NYRB Classics, The Storyteller Essays by Walter Benjamin. Her awards include the 2017 Penn Translation Prize and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She serves as the co-chair of the Penn Translation Committee and is an advisory editor for the Hudson Review. Now, without any further ado, Vince, Daniel, Tess, thank you so much for being here, and I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, Noah, and thank you. Good evening, and thank you to all of you who are coming in many time zones around the world, none of which are convenient. So we're particularly grateful to have you join us for this discussion. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege for me to talk about this sly, capacious, and utterly seductive novel over 900 pages, which is to remain seductive over 900 pages is no mean feat, with Daniel and Vince. Heimito von Doderer himself is a scandalous and a scandalously neglected writer. It's hard to imagine now, but after the Strudlhof Steps was published in Austria in 1956, up until Doderer's death in 66, he was always a contender for the Nobel Prize. And part of the reason he was definitely never going to get it is that early on he joined the Nazi Party. He later abandoned that, but that kept cast a shadow over his life and his work, which we will address in our conversation. He's long overdue for rediscovery, and I hope that Vince's effervescent, bubbling, absolutely energetic translation will help him find a new readership. So I would like to start our conversation this evening by asking both Daniel and Vince to talk about what specifically appeals to them about Doderer's writing and where his work fits into their own personal reading journeys and constellations. Perhaps you could start, Daniel.
Yeah, so I grew up in Vienna and I went to university in Vienna. So Doderer was always there. It's the one country and the one city where he's a major classic of the 20th century, and where everyone who's reading books and is interested in books is reading Doderer. So and I was very surprised later to find out that that's not necessarily the case in Germany, but in Vienna he was such a big presence, and so it would have been strange if I hadn't read Doderer. And I was actually the first time I started reading Strudlhof Steps, I found it just very, very confusing and strange. And I needed to have a second go and to try again and to get through the extreme confusion at the beginning of the book. That's how I always felt about it, to see how it somehow step by step starts to make sense. And then he becomes such a strangely beautiful, rich, complex writer. And then, of course, another book that was very important for me early on in my early 20s was a book that's completely different from the Strudlhof Steps, a novel called Die Merowinger, which is just incredibly funny. It is one of the funniest novels I think ever written. And that's what he had in mind when he wrote it. He just wanted to write an extremely funny book. And so if you ever read The Merowinger, I don't even know whether it's translated.
It is.
It is great. Then you will never. Then you will always have a soft spot for Doderer. You will. It's not his most important novel. It's not his most artistically accomplished novel. He wrote much more important books, but it's just so funny that you cannot help just loving his style and his weird, mad access to the storytelling. And so after the Merowinger, I felt like I need to read more, and I reread Strudlhof Steps several times, and just because I was so fascinated by the strange, complex beauty and unusualness of this book, about which I'm sure we'll talk about that. And there is just the thing about Doderer. It's just like with Proust, wherever you dip into Doderer, sometimes you're confused, sometimes you might be bored, sometimes you feel like I'm really not in the mood for this, but you cannot help being overwhelmed by the beauty and perfection and richness of his language. He's just a master of the German language. And when you write in the German language yourself, I feel like he's one of the writers, and there are not so many of them. You have to come back again and again and again just to see what the German language is capable of.
It's true, there are those long stretches where, perhaps you're not in the mood or it does drag a bit, but then inevitably within a few pages, it becomes a really gripping page turner. There were long stretches when I simply could not put the book down.
Yep.
Are people still reading it today in Austria?
Oh yes, absolutely.
And not just because of the centenary or the 125th anniversary.
No. He's a constant presence. He's one of those writers. He's not. I mean, he's really a writer for the happy few, as Stendhal put it. Like he's all in Austria. It's like he also has a readership in Germany, definitely, but in Austria his status as a major classic writer of the 20th century is kind of completely confirmed, and people actually love to read him. And they have I know many people who have a very, very strong emotional reaction to his work. And especially again with Merowinger, you can have long conversations where you just quote passages to each other and laugh about them and share the memories of your favorite moments in this truly hilarious book. And people actually do that. So there's no need to be concerned about him being a forgotten writer. As long as Austria is on the map, that's not going to happen.
All right, we hope that lasts for a while yet. Vince, tell us about your encounter.
Two little points piggybacking on Daniel. First, the Merovingians is so extremely different from the Strudlhof Steps, but every novel that Doderer wrote is very different from every other one. He has a kind of classic detective story translated into English called Every Man a Murderer. He has sort of bizarrely surreal short stories. He has a gigantic novel called The Demons, over 1,300 pages long, which is a series of chronicles and records. So he's very, very versatile in his writing, but also, as Daniel says, an absolute master. I also have to endorse that many people just simply stop reading the Strudlhof Steps after 30, 40, 50 pages. Yes. I don't know how many people say to me, I don't know why I read this in the first place. I simply could not go on. It's absolutely horrible. At one instance, and I can expand on it, pages 40 and 41 in the English edition, there are several pages about how men used to wear suspenders in 1910, which is one of the time levels. But in the 1923, which is another time level, most of them had worn belts. And then what does this mean? And what does it say about a man? And you think, why am I being told this? And the answer is, well, just wait 750 pages, because the idea of a belt is going to be an extremely important plot device. But and if we have time, I'll read a passage where the narrator seems to just ramble all over the place, skipping from one thing to another, whereas the author has the thing extremely, extremely disciplined. For example, musical structure, symphonic structure. In part one, there's a description of Mary Kay's apartment. And one of the little items is a water tap that drips. In part four, there's a description and the water tap comes back. It is amazing, the blocks and blocks and details of symphonic repetition that come back. And the exact opposite of Daniel, when I first read Doderer in the 60s, I didn't know a word of German. In fact, I decided that I wanted to learn German so that I could read this man in the original. And if you had said then, well, you'll be translating him, I would hardly have believed it. But it's very Proustian too, in the sense that memory and time create an entire universe and a world. But in Proust, after all is said and done, there's a linearness about it. Oh, I had the Madeleine, I plunged back into time, and I'm going to work my way now from about 1885 through the present. In Doderer, we keep going through these two different time levels. One is 1908 to 1910. The other is 1923 to 1925, and they overlap. And there is not necessarily so much a sense of this happened and then that happened, as much there is of impressionism. I'm not sure I would have made it if that had been the first one I read, but I did read The Demons and was fascinated, and have been fascinated ever since.
Yeah, well, another point of the musical aspect, there are even pieces of music that play important, that are pivotal to the plot.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
F sharp Schumann, and it's interesting to see you have the musical motifs and you have the musical motifs that are returning.
One of the key moments, and it's very typical of this novel, is that Melzer, he's in the subtitle, at least in the German, he's standing by a window on a hot summer day and there's a hurdy-gurdy or a barrel organ playing outside. And that simply triggers off an entire set of associations and memories and thoughts and emotions, which he half understands and half doesn't. So that's one way in which music plays a part. And another way is the symphonic structure mentioned. For instance, Renee remembers hearing a piano reduction of a Schumann symphony, for instance. And then the entire structure, these giant blocks of text which come back in motivic repetition.
And then he has one character declare after hearing that reduction of the Schumann, I think music is really just bad for me. He is funny that way. Maybe you could give our listeners maybe a bit, insofar as it's possible, a more compact view of the novel, describe it a little bit, and then we'll have you both read from it to give also a sense of the language, both in German and in English.
My summary is you had to be there. That is, we have two time levels. It's very important. 1910 to 1908 to 1910, before World War I. 1923 to 1925, after World War I. And one of the motifs is that maybe things are not quite as different as the disaster of the war would have indicated. And the two time elements sometimes blend together to where you are suddenly reading about 1925, but you thought you were back in 1911 or something like that. So there's a constant back and forth. And what holds the novel together is the structure of the Strudlhof Steps themselves in the 9th district of Vienna. And there is a magnificent ode to the steps, in which he explains that it's terraces and it cascades downward in its splendor. And the steps were built by a very brilliant engineer to conform to the terrain, and they have no straight lines, so you have to walk indirectly, and you have to follow curves, and you have to follow ramps. And you become aware that that's the structural principle of the novel too. If I want to go from point A to point B on a straight line, I will be frustrated. I'll close the book. I'll never read it. But if I'm willing to negotiate those curves and willing to realize that the experiences in it are being tailored to the terrain of time, the subtitle after all is The Depths of the Years, then I have to surrender and let myself realize, okay, I don't know why we're talking about suspenders, but I hear that in 750 pages, it'll become perfectly clear. The climactic event is a terrible accident that happens. A woman is hit by a streetcar and almost dies. And we're told that in the very first sentence. And we're told that in a parentheses. And so we're clearly given to understand that it is not the events as such, this happens and that happens, that is primary so much as the understanding of constant recurrence. And if I can come back to that accident at some point, I'll do that. In fact, let me now say, the way the book is put together, that Mr. Meltzer, who was a soldier in the war, he's described as never having taken any initiative. He was sent places in the war. He's doing a job. He's very passive. He's never taken any action. And he lives a life in unacknowledged fear. He has a trauma unspecified that involves the color red. He's really frightened of the color red. But at the climactic moment when the woman is hit by the streetcar and she's bleeding to death on the street, he runs up and takes off his belt and uses it as a tourniquet. And the novel describes that as the battle of his life. In other words, characters come to their full realization without realizing it. In other words, his whole life has been preparing him for disposing himself along indirect ways to take that action exactly when he has to take it and break through to his own full humanity and stop being passive and become active, which is fascinating.
I just want to circle back with that structure and your comments just now about sort of being shaped from outside, but also shaping within. In Daniel's excellent afterword, he discusses Doderer's idea of becoming human, of Menschenwerdung. And so perhaps each of you could just say a word or two about how that is reflected in the novel before we read a passage, which is in a sense a kind of a step in one character's becoming human.
maybe Daniel, because I've been talking.
It's your turn, Daniel.
Yeah, it's one of the most fascinating motives in all of Doderer's writing, I think, is it's a very moving process that he describes in several of his novels. His novels are full of idiots. He is fascinated by stupid people and idiots and people who are not able to think for themselves or have emotions for themselves, who just walk through life like robots or like mechanical devices. And then some of these people, and that's where his deep humanity comes in. And he describes how you can actually become a human being. You are not a human being. Human being is something you become by making an effort to break through to really understanding and feeling authentically and without cliche. And you have to learn that. And it's a long process. And this is what he does in Strudlhof Stiege with Major Melzer. He does that with Demons with a working man whose name is Kakapsa, and those novels, especially Strudlhof Steps, they are for the most part one of the big modernist, nearly plotless novels. There is a lot of plot towards the end, and I'm wondering whether this abundance of plot and plotting towards the end is kind of a parody of suspense and plot, because it's something Doderer really doesn't believe in, and suddenly there's so much plot towards the end. So for me, Strudlhof Steps is basically a plotless novel, but the real profound plot of it is Melzer starting out as someone who has no authentic thoughts or feelings, becoming a fully realized human being, by some people helping him and by really making an effort and getting there. And that's the real story of that book.
I just want to read one of the questions that just came in, because I think this ties into it. And that is, Susan Lipman asks, listening to the discussion of this book, I wonder what role fate plays in this novel. So maybe Vince, you could answer that while responding to Daniel's comments.
Yeah, I can stay with Melzer, I think, too. You mentioned that Doderer became Catholic, and some people said, oh, that was just throwing dust in people's faces. But he really adopted some key concepts from Thomas Aquinas, and one of them was something called fatology, fatology, if you will. And that is, willpower is not involved, self-help is not involved, psychoanalysis is not involved. Without any words, people can dispose themselves, just like the steps are built to conform to the terrain that they encompass. We are built to follow, and Doderer would say we are destined by a divine grace to follow our own lives without necessarily knowing what it's all about. We're not always very conscious. And so fate can play a role. And the main thing about fate, I think maybe Daniel might agree, is you don't fight it. You don't say, well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. You simply allow yourself to go through what Doderer calls your tropoi. That is, you are on certain tracks. Now on railroad tracks, I can decide I'm going to get off and I'm going to go to Cleveland, and then I can get off and I can go to Albuquerque. So it doesn't mean that I'm entirely without choice. I must will to be willing to follow along my path. And so one of the great moments for Melzer is, as I said, he's listening to a barrel organ, and just floating through his head are all kinds of memories and regrets and thoughts and so on. He had a commanding officer who died in his arms, and it crushed him, and he finally winds up talking to a dear friend about it. So he is disposed to grow as a human being. And so when that crucial moment comes, where he is walking by chance and sees the woman hit by the streetcar. His moment has arrived. The battle of his life allows him to run right toward her. And so it's almost the Greek idea. How much is will? How much is fate? What do the gods decree? What do we decide? And the answer is yes. In other words, in between. And I think that Doderer puts that Catholic spin of Thomistic fatology on it. There is a providence guiding us if we allow ourselves to be guided and do not take it over. So, and I agree with Daniel, all of that stuff, there's long lost twins and there's a smuggling story and there's this, it all piles up with plot at the end, but it really is more or less plotless. And if time allows, I have a little excerpt to read in which Doderer illustrates that he says he wanted to write a roman muet, a completely silent novel that is based on partly on Stifter with just lyrical description substituting for action, and partly based on Flaubert, who kept saying he wanted to write an oeuvre sur rien. And so magnificent moments of this novel don't have any action at all. And if we get a chance to illustrate that more, we can do that.
I think it's a testament to Doderer's mastery and his absolutely virtuosic plotting, in that while you're reading it, fate looks and coincidence are entirely indistinguishable. So you have the sense, sometimes you have the sense of a puppet master, and sometimes you just think, well, okay, they were, by a hair's breadth and they would have collided. I don't know, I'll ask the two of you, should we read the snake passage or should we read the tropoi?
Let's go with the snake passage. It
Okay,
illustrates and I think Daniel would agree, it illustrates a character is experiencing a moment of extreme, intense self-recognition, but he has no idea what it is that he's recognizing. But that's a perfect example of fatology. He is willing to lend himself completely to this experience that he never, ever understands, but it's a key turning point in his life. So maybe we could read that and then see if we have time for other passages.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting passage for me, because that's when the novel, if we both mentioned that it's very confusing in the beginning, and that's when the novel suddenly springs into full life. When so this, for me personally, this is the real beginning of the novel. René Stangeler meeting that snake in the wood, and there is there is a lot of overwhelmingly beautiful and strong and powerful description of this walk in the woods, and this young man, who is one of Doderer's alter egos, having this very strange moment of, as Vince said, it's self-recognition, but he also doesn't know what's happening here. A lot of it is actually not quite conscious, but still very profound emotional experience. And of course, there are a lot of biblical undertones, because there's a snake in the woods, and it's an absolutely fascinating passage. And we agreed. I'll just read, just so you hear Doderer's original German. I read two very short passages in German, very short, basically two sentences, and then Vince will read a few paragraphs in English. Im Sumpf geschah ein Zucken der Dotterblumen, dann ein Schütteln oder Beuteln der gelben Tupfen. Zugleich rieselte es rechts von der Wand, die den kleinen, in der Sonne grün leuchtenden Fleck begrenzte. René verhielt sich nun eigentlich wie ein primitiver Jäger, ein Buschbewohner oder sonst ein Wilder. Er rührte kein Glied, blieb in der halbgebückten Körperstellung, die er augenblicks eingenommen hatte, legte gleichsam die Ohren zurück und äugte. So bekam er denn auch etwas zu sehen.
Something gray was creeping and gliding on the dirt slope, and from there over to the edge of the swampy place, while even now it was emerging on the other side. By then, René had spotted the head of the snake, which was the largest one he had ever encountered out in nature. It moved somehow through and past the green spot, and soon it was hanging slantwise across the stream bed like a garland, up where the terrain became steep and stony again. On the other side, clods of dirt were still rolling down to the foot of the embankment, from which the end of the snake's tail was just sliding away. The head, with its wide yellow jaws, had meanwhile been feeling its way uphill along the forest floor for some time. Rene knew what species this snake belonged to, of course, and how harmless it was. One clap of his hands would have made it go darting off in a flash, like the crack of a whip. Then again, it would have been possible for him to catch it, given his skill and experience in such matters. And that's just what he had always done too, as if automatically, like some foregone conclusion, whenever he came across non-poisonous serpents. But he had never seen such a huge specimen of Tropidonotus natrix before. It must have measured a good 2 meters in length. On quick reflection, he suspected, and not without reason, as any naturalist would confirm, that a grass snake developed to this size would have been able to wrap far more effective coils around his arms than the ones ordinary specimens would occasionally attempt. This snake that he knew so well, its habits and habitats, its methods of propagation, its movements in water and by land, was now in its immensity a stranger to him once more, a creature new and hitherto unknown. Because Rene didn't make a move, that dragon of a Tropidonotus went slithering leisurely along its way toward a trench cut deep into the side of the ravine, where a little creek flowed into the stream. Rene felt every one of the snake's motions as if he himself were the one executing them, only turned inward to the inside of him, as it were, encountering an obstacle, a branch or a rock when crawling, the head hesitating while the long body remained in motion, bunching strongly in tighter coils behind it, the suddenly resumed forward slithering of the neck, now stretched out from the resulting cluster, which was resolving flex by flex into ever shallower curves. The continuous writhing and weaving of its gray body, which might have been well over 3 fingers thick at its widest part. Only now, as the snake went creeping past closer to him, was its full powerlessness apparent to Rene, and he felt love for it, secret sharer of his solitude here in this ravine. I might add that Rene himself remembers this incident and talks about it and writes about it for years afterwards. So that's an example of a moment of complete self-recognition, but what am I recognizing? That kind of thing.
Does the recognition, the self-recognition grow with the later instances of his mentioning it? It
does. Now, it's going to take another novel. The Demons is a kind of sequel to the Strudlhof Steps. And Rene will not really come fully into his own until that point, whereas Melzer becomes fully human by the end of the novel.
And actually, there was a question in the chat, or in the Q&A, about the relationship between the two novels, The Demons to the Strudlhof Stiege. Are there other characters from Strudlhof that?
Many. Okay. Mary Kay, the woman whose leg is almost amputated by the streetcar, is a very major character in The Demons. And there are many other minor characters and major ones as well. Rene is a very important character. So I'll just take a minute to say this. The German publisher insisted in 1961 that The Demons be the first novel by Doderer in English. And a group of people who had been convened by Knopf Press, they included, for instance, Thornton Wilder, said, no, don't do it that way. First publish this Ein Mord den jeder begeht, Every Man a Murderer, then the Strudlhof Steps, and then The Demons. But the publisher insisted, and you do not introduce an author with a 1,300-page novel. So this is now the prequel to The Demons. This ends in September of 1925 with the marriage of Melzer and The Demons begins in about October or November of 1925 with Mary in the hospital recovering from her surgery and learning how to use a prosthetic leg.
There are quite a few questions, which we will get to shortly, but I did want to ask you, Vince, because this was not only a labor of love, but a Herculean labor, about your experience translating it. One of the absolute joys of the book, it's not just a love letter to Vienna, it's a love letter to the Viennese language, is the way he has such local flavor and shifts in register. He has a sly irony that you don't, very, very different from, say, Thomas Mann's irony. It's a very feline, clever, funny, biting sort of irony. So what were some of the techniques that you used to bring the flavor of Viennese German into the English? I know that's an impossible question. I mean, just as an example, I've heard Susan Bernofsky talk about trying to capture the humor and cleverness and slyness of Robert Walser, and she'll do that by basically playing with registers, but using shifts in register to replicate the experience of shifts in the German. In her case, Swiss German and German, High German, and in your case, it would be the Viennese German and Standard German.
One thing is about the registers, Tess. No matter how sophisticated or elegant the characters, they are drenched in local expressions and local ways of saying things. And so it's a matter of trying to find kind of a equivalent to that. And the best way for me to do that was, first of all, on the conceptual level, was to realize that the irony is always there, and it's a kind of a sly irony. It can be a very biting irony, but there is always that irony there. And I would refer interested readers to a fairly recent book by Marjorie Perloff called The Edge of Irony, in which she talks about how irony is the modality of Austrian writers. And Professor Schmidt-Dengler, the very world-famous, now deceased professor, said, and I think this is true, social and political criticism by Austrians is likely to occur through the use of the language rather than through addressing topical issues. And so there's going to be an undertone, there's going to be an overtone. And I remember once I was complaining that I couldn't find the voice after I had to interrupt for a while. And I sent something to a translator friend, and she wrote back, she said, "It all works really well, Vince, because du hast den ganzen Schmäh." And Schmäh is one of those, like, it's funny and it's not, and it's got an irony and it's got an undertone. So I think it's a matter of realizing that the irony is there. The other principle that's absolutely paramount to me is that if I've read translations that take a long sentence and break it up into 5 or 6 sentences. And in the preface, the translator says something like, "The English language cannot replicate." That's not true. That just isn't true. I'm afraid that translator might mean I didn't try hard enough, or I didn't know how to do it. Because when, for example, there is a very long rhapsodic invocation of the steps themselves and what they look like, there are several sentences that are over a page long. And they are replicating in sound and in structure and in clauses and in cascading effect what the steps are doing. And so I can't very well come along and say, well, I think I'll make 5 or 6 English sentences out of that. So the rhythm, the cadence, the tempo, especially in a work that is so much involved with music, absolutely must be preserved, no matter what, it seems to me. And one of my great moments was I had the very great joy of translating some of Georg Jonke years ago. And I knew him, which was an even greater privilege, maybe. What a wonderful, wonderful man. But he would always say to me, you know, you got this rhythm. He said, I don't understand English very well, but I hear my own rhythms coming back. And I thought, oh boy, put that on my tombstone. So a language rhythm, and then that constant sense of irony and playfulness. And I was at a workshop that you visited once a few years ago, Tess, where I got some very good feedback where people said, don't be so formal. You have to realize in the midst of all this sophisticated banter, they're throwing in some little sly innuendos, and don't miss them, please. So those are my two principles, irony and rhythm.
Yeah, and well, and also I think one thing I noticed about your translation that I found very important is also the assonance, consonants, and rhyming within a sentence. I mean, I know it's important to have the initial epilogue poem rhyme, but you there are, when he does his wordplay, and you can't replicate it on a syntactical level, it seems to me that you use echo and rhyme as a tool effectively.
I think my favorite brief example is Mary Kay and this man that she might have sort of had a kind of a date with, Dr. Negria, and neither one of them showed up, and they meet 13 years later by happenstance, and neither one of them wants to refer to the fact that they never showed up. So there's something about people they always talk most animatedly when they're trying to avoid a subject. But Doderer, of course, makes a wordplay out of es kommt darauf an, nicht auf das zu kommen. And the best I could do, but I have to say I was a little proud, was people never converse more animatedly than when they set out to offset whatever set them off at the outset. So you can't let that go. I know of translators who just simply skip things like that. And I thought I'd rather walk the floors and bite my nails and lose, well, I'm not going to lose weight. On the opposite, I'm running to the refrigerator. But I'd rather have the challenge and see what I can do than just skip it. And trust me, there are plenty of places I wish I could go back to, but I appreciate that because it's the rhyme, the assonance and so on, really, really important.
I think there's so many questions, we should probably address a few. And here's one that's particularly significant because Doderer was not only a Nazi, he also had some unfortunate anti-Semitic tendencies and overtones, more than overtones. Francine Prose asks, there's a strange line. Meltzer says, quote, his mother had no problem with Jews, but there are no Jews in the novel, are there, in Vienna, 1925? As I remember it, his dog whistles about who's Jewish and not are pretty subtle, but they're there. Mary Kay is Jewish, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the way you know that, I think, is because he says that how beautiful Mary Kay's daughter is. She was a Rachel, whereas her son was more of a David fighting a Goliath or something like that. Did I pick that up correctly?
Oh, yes. Uh-huh. In fact, some people think it's a sign of very rampant anti-Semitism that there's this family named Siebenschein, which is considered an insulting kind of a name. And there are all kinds of, I forget, Lea Frauenholzer. There are several Jewish characters. And Mary is Jewish, and the mother, I think, is indicating her broad-mindedness by saying, oh, no, that wouldn't bother me. But yeah, the Jewish element is very, very present, if not absolutely overt all the time.
There are 3 or 4 questions that ask both of you to place Doderer in the group of great Austrian modernists. In particular, Musil, is brought up again and again, asking to what extent was Doderer influenced by him and by the novel The Man Without Qualities, and also, to what extent he was influenced by or interacted with Roth, Freud, and other Viennese writers of the time.
It looks as though Daniel wants to talk. I could certainly address this, but Daniel looks as though he wants to say something.
And address previous questions too, please, Daniel. I'm sorry, I didn't give you a chance.
No problem at all. I just want to say for most of the writers you just mentioned, or that were mentioned in the question, like Roth and of course Freud and Broch, he was the generation after them, so he was younger than those writers. He started out when they were big, but the Man Without Qualities was one generation before the major works of Doderer, but of course he's very similar to Musil in many ways, and I think there is some kind of immense anxiety of influence there on Doderer's part, and he is. They have a lot of things in common. Also, the fact that the books are so long and so plotless in a way, but he is in a way he's much less of an intellectual. This might sound strange, but Doderer, I think, would have been the first to admit that he is much more of an intuitive and also mad writer. He's like a version of Musil if Musil would have gone completely crazy. Like he does really, and I think we haven't addressed that a lot. There are just things happening in Doderer's writing, also in Strudlhof Steps, which are just completely surprising and crazy. Like someone is asked about his name, and it turns out someone has a valet whose name is Scheichsbeutel. And there's a very serious conversation going on, but just one person in the midst of that serious conversation cannot get over the fact that someone's valet is called Scheichsbeutel, because that sounds so weird. And he keeps asking into that serious conversation, is his name really Scheichsbeutel? And then comes this insane sentence, which is just unforgettable, without any explanation. Doderer just says, and at that moment he decided to call his trash can from now on Scheichsbeutel. and then it just goes on. So he does these insane things, and Musil wouldn't have done that. Musil is much more of an intellectual, much more controlled. They do have in common that they have those many different registers, from simple humor to very complicated psychological subtleties. But Doderer is actually, I find him in a weird way, he's less accessible than Musil, because you have to kind of engage with the utter strangeness of his prose, and you have to find a way to like the strangeness, and then you will just love him. And the other thing is also, and I mean, this did come up now a few times, he was a Nazi, and he, in a way, after the war, he never made amends in any way, but he addressed this in his writing in a way which I find very interesting. Or maybe addressed it is the wrong word. He's a writer who has a lot of alter egos in his own books, and he hates those alter egos. Like René Stangeler, whom we just heard about, he's his Stephen Dedalus in a way, like the Joyce's alter ego, but Joyce doesn't hate Stephen Dedalus. Doderer never describes René Stangeler without mentioning that he's ugly and stupid and repulsive. And so there are these two things. One is that he really dislikes himself or his alter egos and himself to a profound degree, and he turns that into something very vivid and energetic in his writing. And the other thing is, of course, that after the war, his writing is so much about how people can be stupid, how they can be idiots, how they can just become non-spiritual entities and how you can find your way out of this. And he himself said, the story of my literature is basically the story of my stupidity. So he must have been a quite unlikable human being. There are lots of descriptions about that, and I knew a few people who knew him, and he was really not a likable person, even without having been a Nazi. Without knowing that he was a Nazi, you wouldn't have liked him if you have met him. But nobody disliked him more than he disliked himself, and he's the opposite of a narcissist. And I think that's how he, in a deep psychological way, how he works through this terrible, idiotic thing that he did by becoming a party member and staying a party member for a while. And I think there is a good way to really profoundly dislike Doderer and still be fascinated and overwhelmed by the quality of his writing. And of course, that's how I would come back to Musil. These are all things that, for a million reasons, that Musil would not have addressed. That's not a topic for Musil. So with Musil, you always have this brilliant, beautiful aloofness, but Musil is quite at peace with himself as a person and as a persona of a writer, and he has every right to be. And Doderer is really not, which makes him more complicated psychologically in a way, and also stranger, and for me personally more fascinating, even though I would never want to decide whether Musil or Doderer is the greater writer, but I think they're actually on a similar level of perfection. Whereas, for example, Zweig doesn't even come close, in my personal opinion.
Just want to footnote real quickly this whole idea about the self-hatred and how Doderer dealt with that after the war. There is about a 45 or 50-page story that he wrote. He wrote a group of, speaking of musical forms, 7 divertimenti. And the last one, the 7th one, is called Die Posaunen von Jericho, the Trumpets of Jericho. And it does exist in English, I know, because I translated it. And it is a profound, profound reckoning with that stupidity that Daniel talks about, profound, extreme remorse, action taken. And I read the story as also a Catholic story, because there is sacramental action that redeems the character, but only after he fully recognizes what a horrible thing he has done. I strongly recommend the Trumpets of Jericho as a kind of balance to what we're talking about, or expansion on what we're talking about.
Vince, I'd also, if you would like you to address the question of his modernism or lack of modernism, because I believe I've read you on that deceptive tension between realism and modernism in Doderer's work, and that might help people place him in the circle.
If you read The Generation Before, Musil, Broch, it's very clearly modernist. If you read the experimental writers of the 50s and 60s, like Jandl, for instance, very declarative modernist. Eliot Pound, Joyce, they are showing off their modernism. I think there's a kind of modernism that sort of dresses itself in more conventional garb. For instance, Joseph Roth, we've talked about him a couple times. They're good old-fashioned reads, those, or Leo Perutz, novelists who write what would look like conventional novels if you're not paying attention, but they are very highly experimental. And I think Doderer was like that. The Merovingians is absolutely crazy, but it purports to tell a regular story, which involves castration and things like that. I won't even go there. But the modernism is not that he says, I'm going to rupture the surface, but we find ourselves again having slid from 1911 into 1923, and we hardly know it. So there are certainly experiments with time. there are breaks in the narration. The author comes in at one time and says, I'm sitting here in a hotel room in 1945 in Norway, and it's cold, and I'm thinking about Meltzer. So there are those kinds of meta elements. And I might add, Doderer hated to talk about influences. So when he was asked about Musiel, he said, oh, well, I'm different. I finish my books. He always had a dig in on everybody. He said he hated Adalbert Stifter, but I think Stifter is all over the place in Doderer. He said that Proust was a minor novelist. All of that, I think, is not only anxiety of influence, but just don't compare me with anybody. And he had writers whom he absolutely loved, most of them not translated into English. But I think that the modernism, it's manifested, and Daniel said it before I did, in that if you're looking for a regular read, point A, point B, point C, point D in Strudlhof Steps, you're not going to find it. You have to allow yourself to surrender to this unusual, apparently rambling form, and that is in itself a modernist element.
And he's really great with, if I can just add those in one sentence, something that really distinguishes him from Musiel, for example, something Musiel is not that interested in is nature. Doderer, for me, is one of the great describers of nature, but he's really very, I think you have to, the only writer you can compare him to in his perfect descriptions of nature is actually Proust. It's incredible how he does woods and the hills around Vienna, but then also it's not quite realistic nature. Maybe I'm wrong, so Vince might want to correct me here, but as far as I can tell, there's never any rain in the book. It's always summer. There are not really seasons. It's an eternal summer. So it's a very, very profound, rich, real nature, but not quite real.
There's only one rainstorm in the Strudlhof Steps, and it is a plot device because people are all over the city of Vienna and they get caught in the rain. So it's sort of like that Wandering Rocks chapter in Ulysses. People all over Dublin see the same thing happening. So otherwise, there's never winter, ever.
One last question to close on, because maybe it will be a happy note. And it's a question I'd like an answer to because I can't remember it. Zihal's last line about happiness. What does it mean?
Pardon me?
What does it mean?
Well, of course, it's taken from Die Fledermaus from the operetta.
Oh, okay.
Glücklich ist, wer vergisst, was doch nicht zu ändern ist. And that's all the way in the beginning. That's a perfect example of musical construction, because when Meltzer gets onto a train, he bumps into his superior, Major Colonel Laska, and Laska is singing that. And so he remembers that whole time. And so what Zihal is doing is quoting Fledermaus, but of course, ironically, no, that is not what happiness is. And then he gives this definition of happiness in this crazy Viennese, Spanish, Baroque, German, bureaucratic language. And of course, then the narrator says, "Isn't that exactly like Mr. Meltzer or Mr. Zihal?"
I would like to point, thank you very much, Vincent, Daniel. This was a fascinating conversation. If you want more granular detail on Vince's process, I encourage you to look at his translator's diary on the Asymptote blog. Noah has put a link in the chat, so please be sure to check that out. And once again, thank you to Community Bookstore for hosting us. Thank you, Daniel, for your insights, Vince, for your translation, and thank you to the audience for joining us.
Yes, thank you everyone so much. And the three of you, this was a really wonderful conversation. I feel we could go all night on Doderer, but it's already very late where Daniel and Tess are, so we should let you go to bed. And Vince, congratulations on this monumental translation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Those of you at home, please do consider purchasing a copy of the Strudlhof Steps from Community Bookstore. We hope to see you at another virtual event very soon. Thank you for joining us and have a great evening, everyone.